He loved his works of art. My children, he used to call them, and only bought those pieces that appealed to his own super-discriminating taste. But he loved a bargain too. Take this statue, for example, the goddess Diana carved by the French sculptor Houdon in 1780. Once it belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia. But then, in 1929, the Soviet government, desperately short of cash, decided to sell off certain works of art from the Hermitage Gallery in Leningrad. And the great international dealer, Sir Joseph Duveen, told this to Gulbenkian and added, very unwisely, that he himself was prepared to bid up to $750,000 to acquire this statue for one of his clients. Gulbenkian realized just how humiliating it must be for the infant Soviet state to show itself obliged to sell off the family silver, as it were, and secretly himself, in his very oriental fashion, approached the Soviet embassy in Paris, suggesting that it would be far preferable for them to arrange a little private transaction with no publicity at all. The Russians agreed, and the result was that Gulbenkian himself acquired this statue for just $30,000. And talking of silver, he also managed to lay his hands on the incomparable collection from the bedroom suite of Catherine the Great. During the reign of Louis XV, most French silver was melted down and used as money. Little remains, and this is certainly among the finest in the world. This magnificent silver-gilt tureen is signed by François Thomas Germain, goldsmith sculptor to the King of France, dated 1761. Together with this lovely pair of candelabra, it too belonged to the Russian imperial court and was known as the Orloff service. Also from the Hermitage came two superb Rembrandts. Nobody seems quite sure whether this haunting portrait is of the goddess Pallas Athene or of Alexander the Great. Not that it matters a rap in a picture as glorious as this one. And the other is one of the greatest portraits ever painted. This wonderful old man, full of gentleness and dignity, but also somehow of inexpressible sadness. Inexpressible, that is, for anyone but Rembrandt. The third great masterpiece to come from the Hermitage collection is Rubens's lovely portrait of his second wife, Hélène Fourmont. When they married, she was 16, Rubens 53. What a marvelous picture it is, luscious and sensuous. You can somehow feel how much he loved her. Gulbenkian, like Rubens, was always a lover of beautiful women, and they abound in his collection. Here is Cupid and the Three Graces by François Boucher. And who could resist these three glorious English girls? Miss Constable by Rumney, Lady Elizabeth Cunningham by Sir Thomas Lawrence, or Mrs. Lowndes Stone by Thomas Gainsborough. Of the three, he probably loved Mrs. Lowndes Stone the most, not just for her beauty, but also because she would have reminded him of another occasion when he got the better of Sir Joseph Duveen, and, once again, by a typically Gulbenkian ploy. One day he met the great dealer in the lift of the Ritz in Paris and told him that a lady of his acquaintance had three portraits, a Gainsborough, a Reynolds, and a Lawrence, which she wanted to sell in a single lot. And in return for this information, he suggested that Duveen might sell him one of the three at his choice, and that in order to make the deal more interesting, more fun, suggested A, that the price for each of the three pictures should be fixed in advance, and B, that the total should not exceed what Duveen had paid plus 10% commission. Now this meant that if Duveen could guess which of the three pictures Gulbenkian was going to choose, he could sell it to him for almost 3 times its real value. Duveen thought long and hard. He knew that the Gainsborough was the best of the three pictures, but he also knew of Gulbenkian's well-known taste for voluptuous ladies, and at last he decided that he would choose the Lawrence. He was wrong. Gulbenkian's eye never betrayed him. Unhesitatingly, he chose Mrs. Lowndes Stone, and he got her for a song. Where the 19th century was concerned, He was an early collector of the French Impressionists. This picture is of particular interest since it's of Madame Claude Monet by Renoir. Gulbenkian bought it straight from the Monet family. And here is the portrait of a painter in his studio by Degas. Another portrait by Degas, a self-portrait this time, painted when he was still a young man on the threshold of his fame. Then there are three superb Monets, including this picture of fishing boats in a harbour, and this wonderful still life. There's also a haunting Millet of a rainbow gleaming over an orchard. As for Edouard Manet, he's represented by this picture of a boy blowing bubbles. And also by this one, another boy smugly hugging to himself his bowl of cherries. More surprisingly, perhaps, for a man of his background, Gulbenkian had an immense admiration for Sir Edward Burne-Jones, whose Mirror of Venus is the last great work we see as we leave the museum. But even Calouste Gulbenkian could not always get what he wanted. His last decade was clouded by his repeated unsuccessful attempts to obtain Goya's masterpiece, the Countess of Chinchon, from a private collection in Spain. Still, as we know, he didn't confine himself to pictures. There was also a stunning collection of French 18th century furniture. This superb pair of bookcases was also bought from the Hermitage in Leningrad. The chest on the left is almost certainly the work of Antoine Robert Gardereau, one of the finest cabinet makers of Louis XV's reign. The tapestries are another joy. This one was made in one of the great Brussels factories in the mid-16th century. It's woven in wool, silk, and gold thread. It tells the story of Vertumnus and Pomona. She was the goddess of fruit trees and orchards, and it came from the Austrian imperial collection. By the early 1920s, Calouste Gulbenkian had a new problem on his hands: where to accommodate his ever-increasing collection, which had long outgrown his London house. Fortunately, it was just at this time that his business obliged him to move his headquarters to Paris, and he now bought and largely rebuilt a sumptuous mansion on the Avenue d'Iéna, which he felt would at last do justice to his possessions. It was a good 5 years before he had everything arranged the way he wanted it, but by the time he'd finished, 51 Avenue d'Iéna was one of the treasure houses of Paris. The strange thing was how little these treasures were seen and appreciated. Gulbenkian himself hardly ever lived at his splendid mansion. In his early years, he had helped to finance César Ritz, founder of the famous hotels, and now in Paris he maintained a permanent suite at the Ritz on the Place Vendôme, leaving his wife with the children in possession of the Avenue d'Iéna. And she cared nothing, but absolutely nothing, about art. During their years in London, when he had dragged her off on endless visits to the Victoria and Albert Museum, she had sat with a book in the entrance hall, often for several hours, while he studied the collections. Later in Paris, she made no pretense of knowledge or even of interest, and nor did her children. As for her husband, if his family didn't enjoy his treasures, he was determined that nobody else should. Requests from experts and connoisseurs to see the house were almost invariably refused. If asked why, his answer was always the same.
Do not forget that I am an Oriental. No Oriental allows other men into his harem.
Sometimes he would add, by way of further explanation, and still talking of his works of art,
My children must have privacy and a home fit for Gulbenkians to live in. They must be happy and must not be disturbed.
His real children were treated with rather less consideration. Every member of the family was obliged to submit a list of not more than 5 close friends who would be admitted when they called. All other visitors would be unceremoniously turned away. But the family did not submit without protest. One day, Gulbenkian, arriving at the Avenue d'Iéna, was horrified to see his daughter, Rita, and her friends sitting out here on the pavement, while the butler impassively served them drinks.
Another side of Gulbenkian's character, strongly reflected in his collection, is his love of nature. Look at this bleak but wonderfully evocative winter landscape by Jean-François Millet. Or this river scene by Daubigny. Or perhaps rather more idealized, Fragonard's Fête at Rambouillet, otherwise known as the Island of Love. For a man who had lived all his life in capital cities and never possessed a country house, it comes as something of a surprise, even a paradox, to find that the third great interest in his life, after his work in the fine arts, was gardening and horticulture. Time and again, Calouste Gulbenkian would astonish visitors by his knowledge and love of flowers. He laid out a magnificent garden on the roof of the Avenue d'Iéna, but it could never really satisfy him. When he was in his 60s, he confided to his diary,
To be a scientist and to dream in a garden to my liking are 2 great aims which I have not achieved.
One of these failures, at least, could be rectified. In the 1930s, Gulbenkian bought himself an estate of 84 acres just outside Deauville in Normandy, with the express purpose of turning it into a superbly landscaped park. It was called Les Enclos.
Fortunately for us, Les Enclos today is still very much as it was in Calouste's time. Before the war, there was a whole army of gardeners working here to realize the great scheme laid out by himself and his landscape architect. And then, after he died, it was presented by the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation to the municipality of Deauville in memory of his great love for Normandy. And it's now a public park. Whether or not he ever really did realize his old dream of communing with nature here and dreaming about it is rather less likely. His more usual practice was to settle down on some conveniently placed piece of garden furniture and study his papers or dictate to his secretary. But nonetheless, it was probably here at Les Enclos more than anywhere else that he did manage to feel at one with the great world of nature around him. If he ever did consider building a house here, it never materialized. The only buildings to be seen on the whole estate are the little aviaries which he had built for his beloved birds, those same birds that we see time and time again in his collections.
For his first 60-odd years, there's no evidence that Calouste Gulbenkian ever took what most of us would call a holiday. He didn't believe in holidays and always raised formidable objections whenever any of his family or employees suggested taking one. It's worth noting that, apart from one brief visit to Jerusalem, in his entire life he never once visited the Middle East for a first-hand look at the sources of his wealth. Such was his ignorance of the practical side of the oil business that once, when he and his daughter were cruising in the Mediterranean, he's said to have asked her, "What's that odd-looking boat there, with the funnel at the back?" It was the first time he had ever seen an oil tanker. But that must have been after 1928, the year he suddenly discovered the delights of foreign travel. For the next 6 years after that, he made an annual journey in the spring or autumn, though he never ventured further than the east coast of the Mediterranean.